For 23 terrifying days, ordinary places became scenes of fear. Gas stations, parking lots, sidewalks, and schools were no longer safe. No one knew where the next shot would come from, or who would be targeted next. In the fall of 2002, a series of seemingly random shootings spread panic across the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The attacks left communities living in fear as investigators struggled to understand who was responsible and why the victims appeared to have no connection to one another. The attacks had already begun weeks earlier in other states, but it was on October 3rd that public alarm intensified. Within hours, several people were struck in different locations across Maryland and the District of Columbia. Some were simply fueling their vehicles, while others were sitting outside restaurants or going about their daily routines. The randomness of the incidents made the situation especially frightening, as there was no clear pattern to predict where the next attack would occur. Over the following weeks, more people were targeted in Virginia and Maryland. Among them were shoppers, motorists, and even a 13-year-old student walking toward school. Some survived with life-changing injuries, while many others sadly lost their lives. Each crime scene revealed the same disturbing clue. Ballistics linked the attacks to a single Bushmaster rifle. As investigators searched for answers, they discovered handwritten messages left behind by the perpetrators. The notes demanded millions of dollars and warned authorities that more lives would be lost if their demands were ignored. One message chillingly instructed police to "call me God," adding another layer of fear to an already tense investigation. Despite thousands of tips in one of the largest manhunts in American history, the attackers managed to avoid capture by using a modified blue Chevrolet Caprice. The vehicle had been altered to allow shots to be fired from inside the trunk, making it extremely difficult for witnesses to identify where the attacks were coming from. The investigation finally came to an end on October 24, 2002. Acting on a tip, law enforcement officers surrounded a rest area in Frederick County, Maryland, where they found John Allen Muhammad and his teenage accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, asleep inside the Caprice. Hidden within the vehicle was the rifle linked through forensic testing to the series of shootings, along with maps, communications, and other evidence connecting them to the crimes. In total, investigators concluded that 16 people had been shot during the spree, with 10 losing their lives. The attacks left families devastated and changed the way law enforcement agencies coordinated responses to serial crimes across the United States. John Allen Muhammad was later convicted on multiple charges, including capital murder, conspiracy, and terrorism-related offenses. He received the death penalty and was executed in 2009. Lee Boyd Malvo, who was 17 years old at the time of the attacks, received multiple life sentences. Courts later revisited aspects of juvenile sentencing, but he remains imprisoned. More than 2 decades later, the Washington area sniper attacks remain one of the most unsettling criminal cases in modern American history. The events demonstrated how fear can spread through entire communities when violence appears random, while also highlighting the importance of coordinated investigations and forensic science in bringing those responsible to justice. Even today, this case continues to be studied by investigators and criminologists around the world. What do you think was the biggest challenge authorities faced in solving this case before more innocent people were harmed? On a quiet afternoon in 1950, gunfire erupted just steps away from the temporary residence of the President of the United States. In less than a minute, a carefully planned attack ended in tragedy, forever becoming one of the boldest assassination attempts in American history. Griselio Torresola was born in 1925 in Jayuya, Puerto Rico, into a family deeply committed to Puerto Rican independence. Growing up, he was surrounded by political activism, and those beliefs would shape the course of his life. In 1948, he moved to New York City, hoping to build a better future. But personal struggles, including the loss of his job and financial hardship, added to an already difficult period in his life. At the time, Torresola was an active member of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, a movement led by Pedro Albizu Campos. The group rejected participation in elections and believed that armed resistance was the only path to achieving Puerto Rico's independence. Tensions had grown after years of political conflict, and many nationalists believed they had exhausted peaceful options. On November 1, 1950, Torresola and fellow nationalist Oscar Collazo traveled to the Blair House in Washington, D.C., where President Harry Truman was temporarily living while the White House underwent renovations. Their objective was to reach the president and carry out an assassination. As Collazo confronted officers on one side of the building, Torresola approached from another direction. A brief but intense exchange of gunfire followed. White House police officer Leslie Cauffield was critically wounded while protecting the residents. Two other officers were also seriously injured as they attempted to stop the attack. With his ammunition depleted, Torresola paused to reload just outside the building. At nearly the same moment, President Truman awoke to the sound of gunfire and looked out from a second-floor window, only a short distance away. It remains unknown whether the two men ever saw each other. Despite suffering life-threatening injuries, Officer Leslie Cauffield managed one final, carefully aimed shot. The round struck Torresola, ending the attack almost instantly. Cauffield later passed away from the injuries he had sustained while defending the president. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute, yet its impact was profound. Oscar Collazo survived, was arrested, and initially received a death sentence. President Truman later commuted that sentence to life imprisonment. Collazo was eventually released decades later. The attack remains one of the closest attempts on the life of a sitting American president. It also highlighted the political tensions surrounding Puerto Rico's status during the mid-20th century. While some supporters of Puerto Rican independence remember Torresola as a patriot, others view the event as a tragic act of political violence that resulted in unnecessary loss of life. Officer Leslie Cauffield, meanwhile, is remembered for his courage and dedication, with a memorial plaque honoring his sacrifice at Blair House. More than 7 decades later, this dramatic event continues to raise difficult questions about political conflict, ideology, and the human cost of violence. What do you think history remembers most from this extraordinary day? He believed he deserved a powerful government position. When every door was closed, he became convinced that God had given him a terrifying new mission. What followed would change the course of an American presidency forever. Charles Julius Guiteau was born on September 8, 1841, in Freeport, Illinois. His childhood was marked by hardship, including frequent abuse from his father. As he grew older, he struggled to find stability, drifting from one ambition to another. He attempted to attend college, practiced law, explored theology, and even joined the controversial Oneida community. But each venture ended in disappointment. Although he managed to obtain a law license, his legal career never flourished. He later published a theological book that was largely copied from another author's work, further damaging his reputation. Despite repeated setbacks, Guiteau remained convinced that he was destined for greatness. His attention eventually turned to politics. During the 1880 presidential election, Guiteau wrote a speech supporting the Republican campaign. In reality, he delivered it only a few times, but he convinced himself that his words had helped secure James A. Garfield's victory. Believing he deserved a reward, he repeatedly sought a diplomatic appointment from the new administration. For months, Guiteau visited government offices, asking for an ambassador position in Europe. Each request was denied. On one occasion, Secretary of State James G. Blaine reportedly told him never to return. Instead of accepting the rejection, Guiteau's thinking became increasingly detached from reality. He claimed that God had instructed him to remove the president for the good of the nation. Over the following weeks, Guiteau carefully observed President Garfield's daily routine. He even postponed one opportunity after seeing that the president's wife was seriously ill, later claiming he did not want to cause her additional distress. Eventually, on July 2, 1881, Guiteau waited inside the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. As President Garfield entered the station to begin a trip with his family, Guiteau stepped forward from behind and fired 2 shots. The president survived the initial attack and was rushed to receive medical treatment. However, doctors at the time lacked modern sterile procedures. They repeatedly examined the wound with unwashed hands and instruments, leading to a severe infection. After enduring more than 2 months of suffering, President Garfield passed away on September 19, 1881. Guiteau's trial quickly became one of the most closely followed court cases in American history. His unpredictable behavior stunned the courtroom. He interrupted proceedings, argued with his own lawyers, recited poems, and insisted that although he had been legally insane during the attack, he was not medically insane. He even claimed that the president's death resulted from poor medical treatment rather than his own actions, a claim that historians acknowledge contained some truth regarding the infection that ultimately proved fatal. Despite these arguments, the jury found Guiteau guilty on January 23, 1882. His appeals failed, and on June 30, 1882, he was executed in Washington, D.C. Moments before his execution, he recited a poem he had written, convinced until the very end that history would vindicate him. Today, Charles Guiteau's case is remembered not only because it claimed the life of a U.S. president, but also because it became one of the earliest major American trials to examine the insanity defense. It also highlighted how medical practices of the era may have contributed to the tragic outcome. Was this tragedy driven more by one man's delusions, or did the medical limitations of the time ultimately seal President Garfield's fate? Moments after one of the most shocking crimes in American history, the person responsible didn't flee alone. Waiting in the shadows was a trusted accomplice whose decisions would help shape the final chapter of the assassination. David Edgar Harold was born on June 16, 1842 in Maryland, into a large family living near the Washington Navy Yard. Intelligent and well-educated, he attended several respected schools before working as a pharmacist and later as a doctor's assistant. Outside of work, he was known for his love of hunting, a skill that would later prove useful during one of the most infamous manhunts in American history. While attending school, Harold became friends with John Surratt, who eventually introduced him to the well-known actor John Wilkes Booth. Over time, Harold became closely associated with Booth and the group that secretly planned to strike against the United States government during the final days of the Civil War. On the evening of April 14, 1865, the conspirators carried out their coordinated plan. Harold guided Lewis Powell to the home of Secretary of State William H. Seward, where Powell launched a violent attack that seriously injured Seward and several members of his household. As chaos erupted inside the house, Harold lost his nerve and fled the scene, leaving Powell behind. At nearly the same time, John Wilkes Booth carried out the fatal attack on President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. During his escape, Booth suffered a broken leg after jumping from the presidential box onto the stage. Despite the injury, Booth managed to flee Washington, where Harold was waiting according to their prearranged plan. Harold remained at Booth's side throughout the escape. He guided the injured fugitive through southern Maryland, using his knowledge of the countryside to avoid capture. Together they reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's injured leg before the pair continued their journey south. For nearly 2 weeks, Harold stayed with Booth as thousands of soldiers and investigators searched for the fugitives. Their escape finally came to an end on April 26, 1865, when Union troops surrounded a tobacco barn in rural Virginia, where the two men were hiding. As officers closed in, Harold chose to surrender peacefully. Booth refused to give himself up and remained inside the burning barn, where he was fatally wounded during the confrontation. Harold was immediately taken into custody. During his military trial, Harold admitted his involvement in the conspiracy, but argued that he had been easily influenced by Booth and lacked the judgment to fully understand the consequences of his actions. The tribunal rejected his defense. He was found guilty of participating in the conspiracy that led to President Lincoln's assassination. On July 7, 1865, less than 3 months after the assassination, David Edgar Harold was executed in Washington, D.C., alongside 3 other convicted conspirators. He was 23 years old. More than 160 years later, historians continue to study Harold's role in the conspiracy. While he was not the man who fired the fatal shot, his assistance during the escape made him one of the central figures in one of the most consequential crimes in American history. Could the escape have ended much sooner without David Harold's help? Or was Booth destined to be captured regardless?